The grand mansion stood glowing under the warm lights of the evening. Expensive cars lined the driveway, and the air was filled with the faint sound of laughter and clinking glasses. Inside, the room sparkled with chandeliers and polished marble floors. Well-dressed guests moved around, chatting about business, art, and travel. At the far side of the room, near the entrance, David stood in his driver's uniform. He was there not as a guest, but as part of the staff, making sure everything ran smoothly for his employer, Mr. Harrow, the millionaire who owned this vast estate. David's teenage daughter, Maya, had come along with him because her mother was working the night shift at the hospital. She sat quietly on a small chair near the wall, her hands folded on her lap, wearing a simple dress. She was clearly out of place in this world of silk gowns and diamond necklaces, but she didn't seem to mind. She had always been shy, especially around strangers. Throughout the evening, Mr. Harrow moved among the guests, shaking hands, making jokes, and ensuring everyone was entertained. His laughter was loud, his voice confident. He noticed Maya sitting quietly and, in a half-playful, half-condescending tone, walked over and asked, "Do you play the piano?" Maya looked up at him, startled. Her eyes darted toward the glossy black grand piano that stood like a centerpiece in the middle of the hall. "A little," she said softly, almost unsure if she should answer at all. Harrow grinned, clearly not expecting anything serious. "Well then, why don't you play something for us, just for fun?" he said, waving a hand toward the piano. His words carried an unspoken assumption that this would be a small, amusing moment for the guests, a distraction, perhaps even a bit of harmless entertainment. Nearby, a few guests overheard the invitation and glanced toward Maya with mild curiosity. Some even smiled knowingly, as if expecting a hesitant, simple tune that would be forgotten in seconds. One older man chuckled under his breath. A few women whispered to each other, already looking back toward their champagne glasses. To them, this was just a child from one of the staff members. David felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew Maya could play, but he also knew she hated attention. She had never played in front of strangers before, especially not in such a fancy place, surrounded by people who looked down on her without even knowing her. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You don't have to if you don't want to," he told her gently. But Maya stood up. Her movements were slow, almost hesitant, yet there was something in her eyes, a mix of fear and quiet determination. She smoothed down her dress with trembling hands and walked toward the piano. The room seemed to grow quieter as she approached, the echo of her footsteps on the polished floor strangely loud. The piano gleamed under the chandelier light, its ivory keys shining like a row of tiny moons. Maya pulled out the bench, its legs scraping softly against the floor. She sat down, her feet barely touching the ground. Her reflection stared back at her from the glossy surface above the keys. Mr. Harrow stood a few steps away, arms crossed, smiling like a man who was about to enjoy a lighthearted show. "Whenever you're ready," he said. His voice carried across the room, drawing more attention from the guests. Conversations slowed and heads turned toward the quiet girl at the piano. Maya's heart pounded in her chest. She placed her fingers gently on the keys, feeling their cool, smooth surface. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. In her mind, she could already hear the melody she wanted to play. It was not a nursery rhyme or a beginner's tune. It was something she had carried inside her for years, something she had practiced late at night when no one was around to hear. Her father stood off to the side, watching her closely. He could see her shoulders tense, the way she bit her lip just slightly. He knew she was nervous, but he also knew that when Maya started to play, something happened, something he couldn't explain. A few guests leaned forward in their seats, expecting the hesitant plink of random notes. Others sipped their drinks, ready to politely applaud when it was over. The air felt still, as if the whole room was waiting for that first sound. Maya's fingers moved, pressing down on the first key. The sound rang clear and pure through the hall, like the drop of water in a silent cave. She followed it with another note, and another, her hands moving with a confidence that didn't match her small frame or shy demeanor. Mr. Harrow's smile froze slightly, the light amusement in his eyes replaced by a flicker of surprise. The conversations that had been quietly continuing in the background stopped altogether. People turned fully in their chairs, their eyes now fixed on the young girl at the piano. In that moment, Maya was no longer just the daughter of a staff member. She was the center of attention, holding the power to command a room full of strangers without saying a single word. The millionaire who had asked her to play for fun now found himself leaning forward, curious, almost uneasy, as if he was beginning to realize that this little request might reveal far more than he had expected. Her father stood rooted in place, his chest swelling with something between pride and disbelief. And though no one could yet know what was about to unfold, one thing was certain: the girl who had been invisible just minutes before was about to change the way every single person in that room saw her. Maya sat before the piano, her small figure almost disappearing behind the wide black frame of the instrument. The polished surface reflected the chandelier's golden glow, making the keys look even brighter under the light. Her hands hovered just above them, fingers trembling ever so slightly. She could feel dozens of eyes watching her, the weight of their expectations pressing down on her shoulders. Her father stood quietly near the far wall, barely breathing. He knew his daughter's talent, but he also knew this was nothing like playing alone in their small living room. Here, in this grand hall, she faced an audience of wealthy strangers, people who lived in a world completely different from theirs. Maya inhaled deeply, steadying her nerves. Then, with a gentle yet deliberate motion, she pressed down the first key. The note rang out, clear and warm, filling the high-ceilinged room. It was not the hesitant sound anyone expected. It carried a quiet confidence, like the opening of a story you know will be worth hearing. The second note followed, then the third, flowing into a melody that seemed to bloom in the air. Her fingers moved with surprising ease, gliding over the keys as though they belonged there. The rhythm was steady, her touch light, yet full of emotion. The piece she chose was not simple. It was layered, rich, and full of depth, a piece she had practiced secretly for years. Guests who had been smirking moments before now leaned forward in their chairs. One man lowered his drink without realizing it. A woman at the back, who had been engaged in conversation, slowly turned her head, her eyes narrowing in curiosity. The room began to change. Laughter faded, murmurs quieted, and the only sound was the music weaving its way through the air. Maya's eyes stayed mostly on the keys, but sometimes she closed them briefly, letting the music guide her hands. The melody shifted from soft and delicate to bold and sweeping, and each change felt natural, as if the piano itself was speaking through her. She wasn't just playing, she was telling a story without words. Mr. Harrow, the man who had casually invited her to play, found himself strangely still. At first, he had expected a simple, awkward tune that might amuse his guests for a moment. Now he was hearing something far more powerful. There was skill, yes, but also a rare kind of feeling in her playing, a connection between each note that pulled at the listener in ways they couldn't quite explain. Her father's heart pounded in his chest. He had heard her play before, late at night when she thought no one was listening, but even he could tell this was different. There was something sharper, more alive in her performance tonight. Perhaps it was the adrenaline, or perhaps it was the fact that she finally had an audience to hear what she had been holding inside for so long. As the melody reached a higher, faster section, her fingers danced across the keys with precision. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the catering staff, moving quietly along the walls, slowed their steps to listen. A waiter stopped in the doorway, balancing a tray of empty glasses, his head tilted toward the sound. A few guests exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from mild amusement to open astonishment. One woman whispered to the man beside her, She's really good." The man didn't reply. He was too focused on the music to answer. The notes grew stronger, fuller, as Maya poured herself into the song. Her small shoulders moved slightly with the rhythm, her face calm but intense. This wasn't the performance of someone seeking attention or applause. This was someone playing because the music lived inside her, and it had to come out. By the time she reached the softer section again, the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. The earlier tension of class differences and silent judgments had faded. In its place was something close to awe, the kind of feeling that made people forget where they were for a moment. She played the last few notes with a delicate touch, letting each sound linger in the air before fading away. Her hands finally came to rest on her lap. For a heartbeat, the room stayed completely silent, not because no one wanted to clap, but because they were still caught inside the world she had created. Then the first pair of hands began to clap. It was a soft sound at first, then another joined, and soon the entire room was applauding. The applause wasn't loud and careless. It was full of genuine respect. People nodded to each other as if to say, "We were not expecting that." Maya looked up at the room for the first time since she began playing. Her cheeks were slightly flushed, and she gave a small, almost shy smile. Her father's eyes shone with pride, and he clapped harder than anyone else. Mr. Harrow stepped forward, his smile different now, not the casual, superior grin he had worn earlier, but something closer to admiration. "That was unexpected," he said, his voice carrying across the room. It wasn't much, but in his tone there was a recognition that something important had just happened. In that moment, Maya wasn't just the quiet daughter of an employee. She wasn't someone sitting off to the side, unnoticed. She was a young musician who had just captured an entire room's attention and made them listen, not because of who she was, but because of what she could do. And deep down, everyone in that hall knew they had just witnessed the beginning of something far bigger than a for-fun request. Whispers began to move through the room like a quiet wind. People leaned closer to each other, their voices low but filled with surprise. Some were asking who she was, others were wondering how she had learned to play like that. A few guests pulled out their phones, trying to capture the moment before it ended. The glow of small screens dotted the edges of the crowd, reflecting the faces of people who had gone from politely curious to deeply impressed. Near the back of the hall, Harrow's wife had stopped mid-sentence in her conversation with a group of guests. Her eyes were locked on the piano, her lips slightly parted. She had studied music herself years ago at a prestigious conservatory and recognized the piece instantly. It wasn't just the choice of music that caught her attention, it was the way Maya played it. The precision, the emotion, the little touches in phrasing were things only a trained and naturally gifted musician could do. Her expression changed from mild interest to genuine shock. Even the catering staff, who were used to ignoring the evening's entertainment while moving between tables, had paused. A young waiter holding a tray of champagne glasses stood still for so long that one of the flutes nearly tipped over. He didn't even notice. Another server peeked in from the hallway, drawn by the music like it was something too rare to miss. At the far end of the room, David stood with his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Pride and disbelief battled inside him. He knew his daughter could play well, but watching her command the attention of this wealthy crowd was something else entirely. All these people, who wouldn't have given her a second glance before, were now staring at her as if she was someone important. The music continued to flow effortlessly. Every note seemed to fall in the perfect place, and the way her hands moved, quick, light, yet strong, made it impossible to look away. Guests who had been whispering stopped altogether, their attention pulled back to the piano. The whispers now came in between sections of the piece, when she paused briefly before moving into the next passage. "She's incredible," one man murmured, his voice carrying just enough for the people around him to nod in agreement. "I thought she was just a child," another whispered, "but listen to that. It's like she's been doing this her whole life." Harrow himself had gone unusually quiet. At first, he had been amused by the idea of her playing. It was supposed to be a light, even humorous moment for the evening. But now, standing there with his arms loosely at his sides, he couldn't deny that this was no amateur. The casual smirk he'd worn earlier had completely faded. The tension in the room shifted. The early air of superiority that floated around many of the guests was gone. Now there was something else: respect, curiosity, and maybe even a little discomfort. People didn't like realizing they had misjudged someone, and yet here they were, caught listening to a performance they would have gladly paid to hear at a concert hall. Harrow's wife took a step forward, almost without realizing it, as if being pulled closer by the music itself. She glanced at her husband briefly, but he didn't meet her eyes. His gaze was fixed on Maya, as if trying to work out how this was happening under his own roof without him knowing. The song swelled into a powerful section, and Maya's fingers flew over the keys faster than some of the guests thought possible. The notes didn't stumble. They didn't hesitate. Every single one landed exactly where it belonged, ringing clear and full in the large room. A man in the front row who had been leaning back casually before was now sitting up straight, his eyes following her hands with fascination. Then, just as quickly, the music softened again, flowing into something more delicate. The shift was smooth, natural, and full of feeling. It was in moments like these that the depth of her gift truly showed. Not just speed or accuracy, but emotion, the kind that made people's hearts tighten without knowing why. David caught the eye of one of the other staff members, an older man who worked in the gardens. The man gave him a slow nod and a small smile, a silent way of saying, "She's something special." David swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. As Maya played, she seemed unaware of the growing ripple she was creating among the guests. She was focused entirely on the piano, lost in the world of the music. Her body moved with the rhythm, her head tilting slightly as if listening to something only she could hear. A few of the guests who had their phones out stopped recording, realizing that no video could truly capture what it felt like to be in that room at that moment. It wasn't just sound, it was the way it made the space feel different, warmer, alive in a way it hadn't been before. At the edge of the crowd, two women whispered rapidly to each other, their words quick and excited. One of them had connections in the music world, and she was already wondering if she could get Maya in touch with someone important. By the time she reached the end of the piece, the room had changed completely. It was no longer a group of rich strangers ignoring a young girl in a simple dress. It was a room full of people leaning forward, waiting to hear more. When her hands lifted from the keys, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged. No one rushed to clap immediately. They seemed to need a second to come back to themselves, to adjust to the fact that they had just been taken somewhere entirely unexpected. And in that pause, David realized something. This wasn't just about playing music anymore. In less than a few minutes, his daughter had turned the way this entire room saw her upside down. She had done what no amount of introductions or speeches could have achieved. She had made them see her worth without saying a single word. Between pieces, the guests clapped and murmured to each other, their faces showing open surprise. Harrow, still standing near the front, leaned slightly toward David. His tone was quieter than usual, touched with a strange curiosity. "How long has she been playing?" he asked, his eyes still fixed on Maya, who was gently flexing her fingers over the keys. David hesitated. He wasn't used to having personal conversations with his employer, especially not in the middle of an event like this, but something in Harrow's voice made him answer honestly. "Since she was 8, he said. Harrow raised his eyebrows slightly, as if expecting to hear about years of expensive lessons, but David continued, his voice calm yet proud. "She's never had formal training. We couldn't afford it. She started on a broken keyboard I found in a thrift store. The thing was missing keys and the speakers crackled, but she didn't care. She just played. She would listen to songs at church or on the radio and then try to copy them. Sometimes she'd get it wrong at first, but she'd keep going until it sounded right." Harrow's wife, standing just behind him, turned her head to listen. There was something in her expression now, part admiration, part disbelief. "No sheet music?" she asked softly. David shook his head. "No. She learned by ear. Every note you hear, she figured it out herself." He glanced toward Maya, his chest tightening with emotion. She'd spend hours on that old keyboard, even after it overheated and smelled like burning plastic. When it finally stopped working, she started using the piano at church. She'd sneak in during the week when no one was around. The guests nearby were close enough to overhear. One man, who had assumed she was the child of some wealthy family's music tutor, now looked at her with new respect. A woman in an emerald green dress tilted her head, watching Maya as though trying to reconcile the image of the shy girl in a plain dress with the extraordinary skill she'd just displayed. Maya adjusted her seat, her small frame straightening as she prepared for the next song. She didn't know her father was telling her story just a few steps away. She had no idea that the people who moments ago had ignored her were now hanging on every detail of her life. David's voice grew softer, almost like he was speaking to himself. There were times she'd ask if she could take real lessons. I always had to say no. Rent came first, then bills, then food. I thought maybe one day, but she never complained. She just kept teaching herself. Harrow's wife glanced back at the piano, her eyes narrowing in thought. She understood better than most how rare it was to see that kind of raw, untrained talent. To play at such a level without years of expensive schooling was almost unheard of. The crowd's earlier polite interest had turned into something warmer. They weren't just hearing a good pianist anymore, they were hearing a story, one that made each note feel richer. People loved a mystery, and Maya had become one in front of their eyes, a girl with no training, no resources, and yet the ability to play like someone born to it. Harrow, though, stayed quiet for a moment. His expression was unreadable, but his mind was turning. He was not the kind of man who enjoyed being surprised, and yet here he was, watching the daughter of his employee captivate a room full of people he had spent years trying to impress. The sound of the piano filled the room again as Maya began a slower, more emotional piece. Her hands moved gracefully, and with every note it felt like she was opening a window into her soul. The guests who had overheard David's words listened differently now. They no longer saw a girl simply playing music. They saw a child who had fought for every bit of skill she possessed, who had worked with broken instruments and stolen moments, turning scraps of opportunity into something extraordinary. One man leaned over to his wife and whispered, "If she's this good without training, imagine what she could do with it." The woman nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on Maya's hands. Harrow's wife, unable to help herself, took a few steps closer to the piano. She wanted to see her fingers more clearly, to watch the way she pressed each key. The phrasing, the expression, the way Maya seemed to speak through the instrument. It was the kind of artistry teachers spent years trying to instill in their students. And here it was, flowing naturally from a girl who had taught herself in silence. David caught sight of his daughter's face as she played. She looked calm, even serene, but he knew that inside she was somewhere else entirely. That was how it had always been with her. When she played, she disappeared into the music, shutting out the world. It was why she could play in front of these people now without faltering under their stares. The soft notes floated through the hall, settling into the hearts of everyone listening. There was no sound except the music and the faint rustle of someone shifting in their chair. Even Harrow's expression had softened slightly, though whether from genuine admiration or calculated interest was impossible to tell. When the song ended, the applause came quickly, stronger this time than before. Guests leaned toward David, asking small questions. What else could she play? Had she ever performed in public? Did she plan to study music? David answered each politely, though he could feel his chest swelling with pride. For years, Maya's talent had been something quiet, private, hidden from the world. Tonight, in the most unexpected way, that had changed. As Maya smiled shyly at the crowd, Harrow studied her with a new kind of attention. The daughter of his employee had just transformed an ordinary evening into something people would remember for a long time, and though she didn't know it yet, her story had begun to spread through the room, woven into the whispers and glances, turning her from a shy girl in the corner into the most fascinating person in the mansion. Maya took a small breath, her eyes still lowered toward the piano keys. The last piece had been gentle, almost like a secret whispered to the room. Now, without saying a word, she straightened her back and placed her fingers in a new position. The shift in her posture was subtle, but it carried a quiet confidence that made a few guests lean forward in their seats. She began to play again, but this time it was different. The melody that filled the room wasn't from any famous composer. It wasn't something anyone recognized. It was hers. The first notes were soft and slow, rising like the sun over a calm horizon. Then, little by little, the sound grew, unfolding into something rich and complex. Each chord seemed to have its own story, each pause its own meaning. People didn't know it yet, but this was a song she had built piece by piece over years, adding to it whenever she felt something too big to speak aloud. It carried the weight of her childhood, the warmth of small victories, and the ache of moments she had never shared with anyone. The guests could feel it, even if they didn't understand it. This wasn't just skill, they were hearing her heart in the music. A few of them stopped blinking for fear of missing something. One woman's hand moved unconsciously to her chest as if to hold on to the feeling the music was giving her. David stood completely still, his hands at his sides. He knew this song. He had heard parts of it late at night when she thought he was asleep. Back then, it had been played quietly on her old second-hand keyboard, almost shyly, as if she wasn't sure it was worth finishing. But tonight, in this vast, shining room, she was letting it live fully for the first time. The melody climbed higher, then dipped suddenly into a slow, aching sequence that made the air feel heavier. A guest in the front row frowned, not in disapproval, but in deep focus. The piece didn't sound like something written by a child. It had the complexity of someone who had lived through things most adults never faced. It carried both sadness and hope in the same breath. Harrow's wife was transfixed. She had heard thousands of performances in her life, many from professional musicians, yet few had gripped her the way this one did. She recognized the deliberate choices in tempo, the way the notes lingered just long enough to touch the audience before moving on. It wasn't something you could teach in a classroom. This was raw instinct, shaped by years of quiet dedication. The guests who had started the evening thinking of Maya as the help's daughter were no longer seeing her that way. They were seeing an artist, one who didn't need permission to take the room for herself. And she did take it. For those minutes, there was no clinking of glasses, no side conversations. The world outside the music didn't exist. Her hands moved faster now, fingers darting across the keys with precision, but never losing the emotional weight. It was like watching a bird in flight, swift, graceful, completely in control of where it was going. The sound swelled so fully that it seemed to press against the walls. Even the air felt thicker, charged with the emotion she was pouring out. David's eyes burned, and he blinked hard, not wanting anyone to see the tears threatening to spill over. He remembered the times he'd found her sleeping at the piano, her head resting against the keys, too tired to make it to bed. He remembered her quietly turning down invitations from friends because she wanted to practice just a little more. All of it had led to this moment where strangers who had never cared about her before were now hanging on every note she played. When the song reached its peak, the power of it washed over the room like a wave. Then slowly she began to bring it down, letting the music fade into something gentler, softer, until it felt like it might vanish altogether. The final note rang out, hung in the air for a breath, and then disappeared. For a moment, there was only silence. No one moved. It was as if the room had forgotten how to breathe. Then the first clap came, sharp and loud in the stillness. It was followed by another, then another, until the entire room was on its feet, applauding. Some guests clapped with both hands and then tapped their foot on the floor, unable to contain their energy. Others simply stood and smiled, shaking their heads in disbelief. It was more than polite approval. It was respect. Genuine, unforced, almost humbled respect. They weren't just impressed by what they had heard. They felt lucky to have been there for it. David's chest swelled so much it almost hurt. He clapped until his hands stung, his eyes never leaving his daughter. She glanced at him briefly, her lips curling into a small, shy smile, but then quickly looked away, embarrassed by the attention. One guest leaned over to Harrow and said quietly, "That wasn't just good, that was unforgettable." Harrow nodded slowly, though his mind seemed far away. He had invited her to play for amusement, for a bit of harmless fun. Now, he realized he had handed the spotlight to someone who had taken it and owned it completely. Harrow's wife moved closer to Maya as the applause died down. "What you just played? Did you write that?" she asked. Maya's voice was small but certain. "Yes." That one word made the woman's eyes widen, and a few guests nearby exchanged astonished looks. The applause finally softened, but the energy in the room didn't fade. People were still talking, still glancing at her like they had just witnessed something rare. And in truth, they had. They might forget the speeches made that night, the expensive wines, even the cause of the charity itself, but they wouldn't forget the girl in the simple dress who had taken the piano and made it her own. David knew it too. He could see it in their eyes. Something had changed. His daughter wasn't invisible anymore. And from this moment forward, the people in this room would never see her the same way again. When the final note of Maya's song faded into the air, there was a strange stillness in the room. It was not the kind of pause that comes when people are unsure whether to clap. It was the kind that comes when no one wants to break a spell. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the faint hum of the chandelier above. Then, as if someone had flicked a switch, the entire room erupted into applause. The clapping started loud and fast, but within seconds it grew into something bigger. People stood from their chairs, their hands striking together with real force. A few whistled, others shouted "Bravo" from across the hall. Some guests smiled so wide it looked almost childish, while others shook their heads in disbelief, as though they could not believe what they had just seen. David felt his throat tighten. He had imagined moments of pride before, when she graduated school maybe, or when she got her first job, but nothing like this. The sight of strangers, wealthy strangers who had probably never thought about her before tonight, standing and cheering for his daughter was almost too much to take in. He clapped along, his palms stinging, but he didn't stop. Maya, sitting at the piano, looked startled at first. She had never experienced applause like this. At home, the most she got was a smile from her father or a quick nod from a church member. Now, an entire hall full of people was on their feet because of her. Her cheeks flushed pink, and her eyes darted down to the keys as if unsure where else to look. From the crowd, Harrow's wife stepped forward, her eyes glistening. She approached the piano slowly, weaving between tables. When she reached Maya, she placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. Her voice carried through the space, not because she spoke loudly, but because the room had fallen silent again, or eager to hear what she had to say. "You have the kind of talent," she said, "that belongs on the biggest stages in the world." The statement hung in the air. Guests murmured in agreement. One man in a sharp tuxedo nodded and whispered to the person next to him, "She's not just good, she's world class." Harrow stood slightly off to the side, his expression unreadable. Earlier in the evening, when he'd invited her to play, it had been a passing thought, something to amuse the guests. But now, watching her bask in genuine admiration, he felt a shift he couldn't quite name. He had built his life around being in control, yet here was a moment he hadn't planned, and it had stolen the entire evening. Several guests moved toward David. A woman in a silk gown touched his arm lightly and asked where Maya studied music. When David told her she had never taken formal lessons, her eyebrows rose in disbelief. Another man asked whether Maya had ever considered performing professionally. The questions kept coming, each one laced with genuine interest, not polite curiosity. David answered as best as he could, but part of him was still standing there in awe, taking in the sight of his daughter at the center of this storm of admiration. He had always known she was special, but to see others finally recognize it made his heart swell. Meanwhile, Maya remained seated, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked at the faces around her, still struggling to understand why her music had caused such a reaction. In her mind, she had simply played as she always did, letting the notes flow until they felt right. She didn't realize that in doing so, she had given these people something rare, an honest piece of herself. Harrow's wife leaned closer to her. "Have you ever played for a large audience before?" she asked. Maya shook her head quickly. "No, ma'am. Just at church, and for my dad sometimes." That answer drew soft gasps from those within earshot. To think that someone who could play like this had never performed for more than a handful of people was almost unthinkable. One older gentleman in the front row, who had been watching quietly the whole time, stepped forward. "I've attended concerts all over the world," he said, "and what you did here tonight, it's rare. Don't let it go to waste." The words struck David deeply. He thought about the years when Maya had been practicing alone, their tiny apartment filled with music while bills piled on the kitchen table. He had wondered so many times if it would ever matter, if her gift would ever be seen by more than a few friends and neighbors. And now here they were, in a room full of people who could open doors for her, applauding like they had just witnessed a miracle. The applause began again, softer this time, but no less sincere. People weren't just clapping because it was polite. They were clapping because they wanted her to feel the weight of their respect. Maya smiled shyly and whispered a quiet "thank you," though she wasn't sure anyone heard it over the noise. David stepped closer to the piano. For a moment, it was just the two of them, even in a room full of people. "I'm proud of you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. She looked up at him and gave a small nod, her eyes shining. Around them, the conversation started up again, but the mood had shifted completely from earlier in the evening. The energy was lighter, warmer, charged with the memory of what had just happened. People were no longer looking at Maya like an employee's daughter. They were looking at her like someone whose name they might hear again in the future, someone worth remembering. Harrow finally approached the piano himself. His usual air of casual authority was gone, replaced by something closer to caution. "Well done," he said simply. His voice was measured, but there was a flicker in his eyes that hinted at a grudging respect. As the guests began to settle back into their seats, David realized this moment was not just about a performance. It was a turning point. People who had never noticed Maya before had now seen her for who she was. The way they looked at her, the way they spoke to her, it all told him the same thing. Tonight had changed something. And in that quiet space between the applause fading and the next conversation beginning, David allowed himself to believe that his daughter's world had just opened wider than either of them had ever imagined. As the night moved on, people began approaching Maya one by one, each with a different expression, some smiling warmly, others still looking stunned. A man in a navy suit introduced himself as the director of a well-known music school. He spoke directly to Maya, telling her she had a natural gift that should be trained and refined. He offered to arrange an audition for her, saying it could lead to a full scholarship if she was accepted. Before Maya could even respond, another guest, a woman with silver hair and a confident voice, stepped forward. She explained that she worked with a youth orchestra that toured internationally. She said she had seen many young musicians, but very few who could play with such emotion and precision without formal training. She handed Maya a card and told her to call any time if she wanted to perform with them. David stood beside his daughter, trying to take it all in. His mind was spinning with the sudden shift in their reality. For years, he had worked quietly, making just enough to keep their small home running. Music had been Maya's private joy, something she shared only with him. Now, in the span of an hour, strangers with power and influence were offering her opportunities that could change her life forever. Even Harrow, who had started the evening treating Maya like a small curiosity, now seemed eager to be involved. He stepped closer, his voice carrying just enough for nearby guests to hear. "Maya," he said, "I'd like to sponsor your education at the best conservatory in the country. I can make the arrangements immediately." He smiled, as if certain his offer would be accepted on the spot. Maya froze. She wasn't sure how to answer. The idea of going to a real music school felt both exciting and terrifying. She glanced at her father, looking for some sign of what she should do. David's heart swelled with pride, but he also felt cautious. He knew Harrow, knew the man didn't do anything without expecting something in return. A few other guests were watching closely now, sensing the moment had shifted into something bigger. The room felt warm, the air thick with expectation. David could almost feel the weight of every gaze pressing down on them. The man from the music school stepped in again. "She doesn't have to decide right now," he said kindly. "Talent like this needs to be nurtured, but it should be her choice." His words gave Maya a small relief. She nodded slowly, holding the business card tightly in her hand like it was something precious. Harrow's wife, who had been silent since her earlier praise, suddenly spoke up. "Whatever path she chooses," she said, looking around the room, "I think we all agree that what we witnessed tonight was something rare." The guests murmured their agreement, some even clapping lightly again. One man, clearly moved, said, "This is the kind of story people remember. From a thrift store keyboard to this, it's remarkable." His words made David's chest tighten. Hearing someone else speak of his daughter's journey out loud reminded him of every late night she had practiced, every time she had stayed up long past bedtime to work on a piece no one would hear. Until now. Maya looked down at her lap, her fingers brushing the edge of the piano bench. She could still feel the keys under her hands, still hear the music in her head. All these people were offering her things she had never imagined, Yet the part that felt most real was still the moment she had sat down and played just for the sake of playing. David placed a hand gently on her shoulder. She looked up at him, and he gave her a small nod, the kind that said, "Whatever happens, I'm with you." Harrow, perhaps realizing the night was winding down, added, "Think about it, Maya. My offer stands. I'll cover everything: lessons, instruments, even travel for competitions. You just say the word." His tone was smooth, but there was an edge beneath it, as though he wanted to be the one credited for her success. The room began to shift back to its usual hum of conversation, but the energy was different now. People were still glancing at Maya, still speaking about her in low voices. A few approached David to shake his hand, congratulating him as though he had been the one to perform. Before they left, the man from the music school came to David one last time. "Don't let this moment fade," he said seriously. "She has something you can't buy, something that can't be taught. The world needs to hear her." As David led Maya toward the exit, she looked over her shoulder at the piano. It sat quietly now, gleaming under the lights, as if it had been waiting for someone like her all along. She tightened her grip on the cards she had been given, feeling the weight of the possibilities they carried. The night had begun with her sitting silently in a corner, unnoticed. It was ending with her walking out the door as someone everyone in that room would remember. And though she didn't yet know what choice she would make, one thing was certain: her life would never be the same again. Months later, the air inside the grand concert hall was charged with quiet excitement. Hundreds of seats were filled with people from different parts of the country: musicians, critics, families, and strangers who had heard about the young girl with an extraordinary gift. The stage was lit with a soft golden glow, and in the center stood a polished black piano that seemed to wait patiently for her touch. Backstage, Maya stood in a long black gown, her hands resting lightly against the fabric. She could hear the faint murmur of the crowd and the occasional shuffle of programs. Her father was with her, wearing a simple suit that looked new but modest. He had never been to a place like this before, yet he stood tall, his eyes fixed on her with the same pride he had felt that night in Harrow's mansion. "Just play like you always do," he whispered, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "The rest will take care of itself." Maya nodded, her heart beating fast. She wasn't nervous about the music. She had practiced every note until it was part of her, but the weight of the moment pressed on her. This wasn't just a performance. It was the beginning of everything she had dreamed about without even daring to believe it could come true. A stagehand gave the signal, and Maya walked out into the light. The audience applauded politely at first, not yet knowing what to expect. She reached the piano, adjusted the bench, and took a deep breath. For a moment, she let her eyes travel over the crowd, and there, in the front row, she saw her father. He gave her a slow nod, the same one he had given her months ago when everything had changed. She placed her fingers on the keys, and the first notes rang out, pure and steady. The sound filled the hall instantly, drawing the audience closer without them realizing it. She began with a classical piece, something familiar, something to show them her control and technique. Her fingers moved effortlessly, each note falling into place like drops of water forming a perfect stream. As she played, she could feel the tension in the room shifting. People were leaning forward in their seats, their eyes locked on her hands. The music built in intensity, and when the final chord of the first piece rang out, there was a brief pause before the applause broke. It was louder than before, warmer, and it wrapped around her like a blanket. Then she began the piece that had brought her here, her own composition, the one she had first played at Harrow's mansion. The opening notes were soft, almost hesitant, like the start of a story. But soon the melody swelled, carrying the same emotion it had that night, yet deeper now, shaped by the months of practice and the confidence she had gained. The audience was silent, except for the music. It was the kind of silence that meant they were completely hers, that every note was holding them in place. She poured everything into the song: the years of playing on broken instruments, the late nights in a quiet apartment, the moment her father had told her he was proud, and the faces of the people who had once overlooked her but would never forget her now. Her father sat motionless, but inside he was holding back tears. He remembered every moment of the journey that had led them here, from the day she had found the broken keyboard to the night she had stunned a room full of wealthy strangers. Now, she was no longer a surprise. She was exactly where she belonged. The final section of her piece rose in a powerful wave before softening into a delicate, fading line of notes. She lifted her hands, letting the last sound drift into the air until it disappeared completely. For a second, there was no movement, no sound, only the lingering feeling of the music still touching every person in the room. Then the applause came, thunderous and unrestrained. People stood, clapping and cheering, some even shouting her name. Flowers were thrown onto the stage, their petals scattering near her feet. She stood slowly, giving a small bow, her cheeks flushed, but her eyes bright with something beyond joy. It was the quiet knowledge that she had truly arrived. The director of the music school was in the audience, smiling proudly. The woman from the youth orchestra was there too, clapping with both hands, her eyes shining. Harrow's wife was seated in the third row, her face lit with satisfaction at seeing Maya claim her place in the world of music. Even Harrow himself was present, his expression unreadable, though his applause was steady. Maya looked to the front row again, where her father stood now, clapping harder than anyone. She locked eyes with him, and for a brief moment, the noise of the hall faded away. She remembered his words from backstage, remembered the years of quiet sacrifices he had made so she could have even the smallest chance to play. She gave him the smallest, softest smile, the kind that said everything without speaking. When the applause finally began to fade, she stepped away from the piano, her gown swaying with her movement. As she walked off stage, she felt the weight of the moment settle inside her, not as a burden, but as a truth. This was no longer the shy girl sitting in the corner of a room while others ignored her. This was a musician who had taken her first real step into the world she belonged in. Backstage, her father wrapped her in a hug so tight she could barely breathe. "You did it," he said quietly, his voice shaking. She hugged him back, holding on a little longer than usual. "We did it," she corrected softly. As they left the concert hall later that night, the city lights seemed brighter, the air lighter. Maya carried no flowers, no trophies, just the knowledge that this was the beginning. The sound of the audience's applause still echoed in her mind, not as a memory of fame, but as proof that music, her music, could reach people's hearts. And as long as she had that, she knew she would keep playing for the rest of her life.